At 50 years old, when a woman asks only for respect, peace, and loyalty, her husband walks away. He leaves his pregnant wife behind and brings his young mistress into their home like a replacement. He believes her life is over. Too old, too weak, too replaceable. What he doesn't know is that the woman he abandoned is the only daughter of a secret trillionaire whose recent death is about to shake the world. And the child she carries will change everything. Margaret was not a young woman chasing dreams. She was 50 years old, a woman who had given her youth, her strength, and her silence to one man for over 2 decades. Everyone saw her as invisible, a quiet wife, a burden, a woman with no future. Her husband believed he could discard her without consequence. He chose desire over loyalty, ego over gratitude, and welcomed another woman into the life she had built. But fate was working in the shadows. Unbeknownst to them all, Margaret was unaware that she was the sole heir to a hidden financial empire left behind by a father the world never knew as hers. As betrayal unfolds and arrogance grows, this story reveals a powerful truth. Sometimes, the woman you underestimate the most is the one holding the legacy that will destroy you. This is not just a story of betrayal. It is a story of patience, dignity, and devastating karma. Hello, dear listeners. Thank you for joining me today. Before I begin my story, I would be very happy if you subscribed to the channel and left a comment writing which state or country you are listening from. It always warms my heart to see how far our stories travel. So now, let me tell you this story. Sit back, relax, and enjoy. The woman he thought was finished. Margaret Collins was 50 years old when her life quietly began to fall apart. She didn't look fragile. She didn't cry easily. And she certainly didn't look like a woman about to lose everything. Yet on that cold October evening, as rain tapped softly against the kitchen window of the suburban Chicago home she had lived in for 23 years, Margaret knew something was wrong. She stood alone in the kitchen, one hand resting gently on her stomach, the other gripping the edge of the counter as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. Pregnant. The words still felt unreal. At her age, doctors had warned her. Friends would have whispered. Society would have judged. But none of that frightened her as much as the look she had seen earlier that day in her husband's eyes. Richard Collins. The man she had married at 27. The man she had supported while he built his career. The man she had forgiven again and again for his emotional distance. The man who no longer looked at her like a wife. Margaret had always been the quiet kind of strong. Not loud. Not dramatic. She was the woman who remembered appointments, paid bills, cooked meals, hosted holidays, and held everything together while being seen by almost no one. And now, somehow, at 50 years old, she was carrying a child. She hadn't told Richard yet. She had wanted the moment to be right. Wanted him relaxed. Wanted to believe, just for a second, that this news might bring them closer. But the distance between them had grown into something cold and sharp. The front door opened. Margaret straightened. Richard's footsteps echoed through the hallway. His shoes were polished, his coat expensive, his scent unfamiliar, too sharp, too young. "You're still up," he said, loosening his tie without looking at her. "Yes," Margaret replied softly. "I was waiting." Richard checked his watch. "It's late." "I know. I just needed to talk to you." He sighed, the sound heavy with irritation. "Can it wait?" Margaret swallowed. "No." That single word made him look at her. Really look. And for a moment, something flickered across his face, annoyance, maybe guilt, but it disappeared quickly. "What is it?" he asked. Margaret took a step forward, her hand trembling slightly as it rested over her abdomen. "I went to the doctor today." Richard frowned. "Why?" She hesitated. "Because I wasn't feeling well. And I'm pregnant." The silence that followed was not shock. It was disbelief, followed by something far worse. Richard laughed. A short, bitter laugh. "You can't be serious." "I am," Margaret said quietly. "The tests confirmed it." "That's impossible," he snapped. "You're 50, Margaret." "I know," she replied, her voice shaking. But it happened. Richard ran a hand through his hair. This is insane. I didn't plan it, she said quickly. I swear. I was scared too. But maybe what? He cut in. Maybe you think this fixes things? Margaret felt her chest tighten. I thought you'd want to know. Oh, I want to know, he said coldly. I just don't want this. The words hit her harder than she expected. I'm not doing this again, Richard continued. I'm not starting over. I didn't sign up to be a father at this age. It's our child, she whispered. Richard looked away. You should have thought about that. Her eyes filled with tears, but none fell. I need time, he said, grabbing his coat. I won't be coming home for a few days. Richard. Don't, he warned. Just don't. The door slammed shut. Margaret slowly lowered herself into a chair. Her hands pressed protectively against her stomach. She didn't cry. She simply sat there, listening to the rain, feeling something inside her break in a way that couldn't be repaired. What Margaret didn't know, what no one knew, was that at that very moment, thousands of miles away, lawyers were opening sealed documents. Documents tied to a man whose death had quietly shaken the highest levels of global finance. A man the world knew as Jonathan Hale, a reclusive industrialist, a silent investor, a trillion-dollar shadow. And a man Margaret had never known was her father. The next morning, Margaret woke up alone. Richard hadn't returned. The bed felt colder than it ever had. She moved slowly through the house, every corner filled with memories, Christmas mornings, birthday dinners, quiet evenings that once felt safe. Her phone buzzed. A message from Richard. We need to talk. I've made a decision. Her heart sank. She knew what that meant. By the afternoon, she found herself sitting across from him in a cafe she barely recognized, modern, sleek, and far too loud. He didn't look nervous. He looked relieved. I can't do this anymore, he said plainly. This marriage has been over for a long time. Margaret stared at him. And the baby? That's your responsibility, he replied. Not mine. Her breath caught. How can you say that? Because I'm being honest, he said. I've moved on. The words burned. Moved on. With who? She asked, though she already knew. Richard leaned back. Her name is Olivia. Younger. Prettier. Easier. She understands me, he continued. She doesn't drain me. Margaret felt something cold settle in her chest. So that's it? She asked. 23 years, and I'm nothing? You're not nothing, he said impatiently. You're just done. Done. As if she were a phase. A chapter he could close. I want you out of the house, he added. It's cleaner that way. Margaret laughed softly once. That house is in your name, he said. I'll have my lawyer contact you. She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized something terrifying. The man she loved was already gone. She stood up. Take care, Richard, she said calmly. He watched her leave without standing. Without regret. That night, Margaret packed a small suitcase. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay. As she closed the door behind her, she paused for a moment, resting her hand on her stomach. I don't know what's coming, she whispered. But I won't let him destroy us. Miles away, in a glass-walled office overlooking Manhattan, a lawyer stared at a photograph. A faded image of a young woman holding a baby. Margaret. The final heir. The woman who had no idea that everything was about to change. The arrival of Olivia. The mistress enters. The Collins house felt different that morning. Margaret had not slept well. Not because of the pregnancy, not because of the uncertainty, but because she knew that once Richard brought Olivia into their home, everything would change. She had always been a private person. Even in anger, she had been silent. But now, the house she had built with decades of care and memories would be invaded. By someone younger. Someone easier. Someone who could fit Richard's selfish world. Margaret had spent the early morning packing essentials into a small suitcase. Clothes, personal items, a few photographs she could never bear to throw away. Each item reminded her of what she had built, what she had lost, and what she was about to fight for. The doorbell rang. Margaret froze. She had known it would come. She had imagined it 1,000 times. but the sound still pierced her nerves like ice through her chest. She took a deep breath and walked to the front door. There she stood. Olivia. 28. Maybe 29. Young, confident, radiant. A woman who didn't seem to carry a care in the world, except for the fact that Richard had made her the center of his universe. Olivia smiled brightly, the kind of smile that made Margaret's stomach twist, not just because of jealousy, but because she could see exactly what her husband had been blinded by. "Hi," Olivia said, stepping forward. "I hope it's okay I'm here today. Richard said I could come by." Margaret's hands trembled slightly, but she forced her voice to remain steady. "This is my home," Margaret said softly, standing tall. "You don't just enter because he says so." Olivia's smile didn't falter. Instead, she tilted her head, surveying the house with curiosity. "Oh, I know. But he invited me. And I thought, well, I might as well see where he spends most of his time. Don't you think?" Margaret's eyes narrowed. She felt her pulse race. Every nerve in her body was screaming. This woman had no idea how much of a storm she had walked into. "Right," Margaret said, voice calm but deadly serious. "Then I suppose I should make sure you're comfortable while you're here." Olivia's eyes glimmered, as if she could sense the quiet warning beneath Margaret's calm tone. But she was fearless. Young, naive, or perhaps simply bold. "Thank you," she said sweetly. "I appreciate it." Margaret stepped aside, letting Olivia enter, but her posture was stiff, her gaze unwavering. She watched Olivia take in every corner of the house, every decoration, every photograph. Margaret's life, her memories, her decades of love and effort were on display, silently judged. Olivia paused by the family photos on the mantelpiece. Margaret noticed the way her eyes lingered on the photos of Richard and her. Margaret's jaw tightened. "You've been here a long time," Olivia said softly, almost conversationally. "I mean, this house, it's beautiful. He's lucky to have had you." Margaret's heartbeat skipped. She corrected, with quiet emphasis. Olivia blinked, momentarily thrown off, but quickly masked it with a smile. "Right. Was. I understand." Richard arrived soon after, carrying coffee for Olivia in one hand and his phone in the other. He didn't even notice Margaret's sharp glance, the one that carried all the years of betrayal and silent suffering. "Margaret," he said casually, "this is Olivia. She's moving in for the time being." Margaret's eyes flared. "Moving in?" "Yes," Richard said with a shrug. "She'll stay in the guest room. I'll handle the rest." Margaret's mind raced. She had expected disrespect. She had even prepared herself for humiliation. But this was an invasion. A calculated erasure of her place in her own home. "I see," Margaret said softly, stepping forward. Her hand instinctively resting on her belly, feeling the small, silent life growing within her. "And what am I supposed to do?" Richard gave a dismissive glance. "You can handle yourself. You're not going anywhere. Right?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. She nodded. She could survive. She had survived worse. But the humiliation, that she could not ignore. Olivia, unaware of the tension, smiled brightly and held out her hand. "It's so nice to finally meet you, Margaret. I've heard a lot about you." Margaret looked at the hand, then at the young woman's face. There was something unsettling about Olivia's innocence. She didn't know whether it was feigned or real, but she would find out soon. "I imagine you have," Margaret said, her tone polite but cold. "Welcome to my home, Olivia. I hope you find it comfortable." Olivia's smile widened. "Oh, I already do." The first few hours were unbearable. Olivia wandered freely, opening cabinets, rearranging things slightly, asking casual questions that pierced Margaret's nerves. "Where do you usually keep the sugar?" Olivia asked brightly. Margaret had used the same sugar bowl for 20 years. The thought of this young woman touching it, moving it, was infuriating. "In the cabinet above the counter," Margaret said softly, watching Olivia retrieve it as if she owned the house. "You've got a great setup here," Olivia continued. "I love how open the living room is. Did you do all this yourself?" "Yes," Margaret replied, barely keeping her composure. "Every detail." Olivia nodded, smiling politely, and set the sugar back exactly where she had found it. But Margaret could feel the invasion deep in her bones. Every movement, every glance, every word was a subtle assertion. This is my place now. Richard, oblivious to Margaret's internal storm, moved on with casual conversation. He was at ease, chatting and laughing with Olivia as though Margaret didn't exist. Margaret stayed silent, moving through the house with the precision of a woman who had been trained in patience. Every glance, every gesture, every word was measured. She would not make a scene. Not yet, because she knew something they did not. Something bigger than humiliation. Something that would shift the balance entirely. She was still the quiet heir of a hidden empire. She still had the strength to turn the tables. But for now, she endured. Hours later, Richard left to handle some work, leaving Margaret and Olivia alone. The young woman leaned casually against the counter, glancing around the house again. So, Olivia said, tilting her head. You and Richard, you were married a long time, right? Margaret gave a small nod. 23 years. Olivia's eyes widened slightly. Wow, that's impressive. But I get it. People change. Margaret's hand instinctively rested over her stomach. Yes, she said softly. People do change. There was a pause. Olivia tilted her head again, studying Margaret. You don't seem upset. I thought, maybe you'd be angry. Margaret's lips curved in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. I'm older than I look, she said. And I've learned that anger isn't always the strongest response. Patience can be far more powerful. Olivia blinked, a faint unease creeping into her expression. She wasn't used to meeting someone who didn't react immediately to betrayal. Margaret's gaze was calm but piercing. Every word, every gesture, every breath seemed to say, I'm not defeated. You may think you've won, but this is far from over. By evening, Margaret had prepared a simple dinner for herself. Olivia sat across from her, chatting lightly, while Margaret remained mostly silent, sipping her tea. The young woman's casual presence was a constant reminder of the betrayal. And yet, Margaret noticed something remarkable. She did not feel powerless. Instead, she felt alive. Strong. Focused. She had endured humiliation, betrayal, and disdain for decades. And now she was ready to face it head-on. Because this child she carried, this silent life within her, it was not just a gift. It was a promise. And Margaret Collins had always been a woman who kept her promises. Silent storm. Margaret's quiet strength. The days following Olivia's arrival were the longest Margaret had ever endured. Richard seemed to be at ease, completely absorbed in the excitement of a new relationship, completely unaware of the storm that quietly simmered within his home. Olivia moved freely through the house, unpacking small things, rearranging her temporary space as if she owned it. Margaret observed quietly, her every movement deliberate, her silence far more powerful than any argument. Every morning, Margaret walked through the house with purpose, her hand resting protectively on her belly. Each corner, each photograph, each memory was a reminder of what she had built, what she had endured, and what she still had the power to claim. Richard's arrogance. Richard had become careless. He no longer even noticed the subtle dominance Margaret had over her own home. Would you like some coffee, Olivia? He asked one morning, smiling and oblivious. Thanks, Richard, Olivia replied, looking up from the cabinet she was rearranging. Margaret had already poured herself a cup, but she chose not to acknowledge him. Her silence was deliberate. Richard frowned but quickly returned to his phone. Margaret's heart beat steadily. She allowed herself this small victory, silence. Her restraint. Richard had no idea how much control he had just lost, even without realizing it. Olivia's subtle threat. Olivia, for all her youth and naivety, began to sense Margaret's presence as more than just the older wife. There was a quiet confidence in Margaret that was impossible to ignore. You've lived here a long time, haven't you? Olivia asked one afternoon, her tone casual, but her eyes studying Margaret carefully. Over 20 years, Margaret replied softly. A lot can happen in 20 years. Olivia's smile faltered slightly, but she quickly recovered. Yes, but people change, right? Margaret's eyes narrowed. She could see the arrogance and entitlement hiding behind Olivia's polite words. It was clear Olivia believed she had already won. Margaret merely nodded. Yes, they do. And sometimes, they forget the people who quietly stayed while they celebrated themselves. Olivia paused, unsure whether Margaret's calm tone was anger or warning. The first hint of power. Margaret had spent decades unaware of her true heritage. The secret, carefully hidden by her late father Jonathan Hale, had remained buried. But recently, strange documents and letters had started arriving in the mail, addressed to Margaret from unknown lawyers and financial advisors. At first, she had ignored them. But now, with Richard's betrayal and Olivia's intrusion, she realized the significance of these envelopes. Each letter was a piece of the puzzle, her inheritance, her father's secrets, the empire that had been waiting for her claim. The thought alone made her blood race. This was not just a child growing inside her. This was a life of untold power waiting to awaken. Margaret's observation. Over the next few days, Margaret became a silent observer. She noticed the small ways Olivia tried to assert control. Moving personal items without asking. Flipping through family photos with curious fingers. Speaking casually about things she didn't understand. Margaret allowed it. She smiled politely. She allowed them to believe they had power. But inside, Margaret was planning. Every action, every word, every detail was being stored in her mind. She was preparing for the day when the truth would come to light. Richard, unaware of Margaret's quiet storm, continued to flaunt his affection for Olivia. He laughed freely, he smiled, he spoke openly about their plans, thinking Margaret was helpless and isolated. Margaret did not intervene. Not yet. The first confrontation. It wasn't long before the first confrontation became inevitable. Margaret was in the kitchen, preparing her tea, when Olivia approached with a small smirk. "You're awfully quiet," Olivia said. "I mean, don't you want to be happy for us?" Margaret turned, her calm gaze piercing. "I am happy for you," she said softly, "for the illusion of happiness." Olivia's brow furrowed slightly. "Illusion?" "Yes," Margaret said, stepping closer. "Happiness built on someone else's pain is always an illusion. Eventually, reality catches up." Olivia laughed nervously, stepping back. Margaret's quiet confidence had unnerved her. She hadn't expected the older woman to challenge her, not with words, and certainly not without raising her voice. Margaret's calmness was a weapon. Every measured step, every small gesture radiated authority. Olivia realized that, for the first time, she was facing someone she could not manipulate with charm alone. Richard's blindness. Richard arrived home that evening, carrying bags of groceries, chatting about his upcoming weekend plans with Olivia. Margaret watched silently from the kitchen doorway. She didn't intervene. She let them celebrate. She let Richard believe he had conquered her completely. He had not. Inside Margaret, a plan was forming. Not a plan born of anger. Not a plan born of desperation. But a plan born of decades of patience, resilience, and silent power. Her father's legacy, hidden from the world, waited. Her child, innocent and unaware, waited. And soon, the day would come when Richard and Olivia would realize that they had underestimated the wrong woman. The emotional core. Margaret sat alone that night, the house quiet around her. She closed her eyes and placed her hand on her stomach. "I won't be defeated," she whispered. Not by him. Not by her. Not by anyone. Tears of frustration threatened, but she swallowed them. She had survived decades of neglect, betrayal, and humiliation. She would survive this too. Every silent breath, every quiet movement, every patient step was a small victory. She thought of the empire that awaited her, the inheritance of her father, Jonathan Hale, who had hidden the truth of his fortune carefully. She thought of the child growing inside her, the living proof of resilience and strength. And she smiled faintly. Not because she was happy, but because she knew the storm was coming. And when it hit, nothing would survive in Richard and Olivia's world. Margaret sat in the dim glow of the kitchen light. Olivia had finally retreated to her room, satisfied with her temporary dominion. Richard was still oblivious, chatting away, unaware of the quiet power in his house. Margaret looked down at her hands. They were strong. They were capable. They had held a home together for decades. They had carried life and love and patience through every hardship. And now, they would hold the power to change everything. For the first time in years, Margaret slept that night not in fear, but in anticipation. Because the woman they thought defeated, the woman they tried to erase, was just beginning to rise. The quiet storm had begun. When silence becomes survival. Margaret learned very quickly that humiliation didn't always come loudly. Sometimes it arrived quietly. Through paperwork. Through whispers. Through the cold, polite tone of people who once smiled at her. 3 days after Olivia officially moved in, a large envelope arrived at the house. Margaret recognized the law firm's name immediately. Richard's lawyers. She stood in the entryway, the envelope heavy in her hands, her heart beating slowly but steadily. She had expected this. Men like Richard didn't end marriages with conversation, they ended them with contracts. She opened it carefully. A separation agreement. Temporary financial terms. A request for her to vacate the property within 14 days. 14 days. After 23 years. Margaret sat down at the dining table, her hand drifting instinctively to her belly. The baby kicked softly, as if reminding her she wasn't alone. "They think we're weak," she whispered. She folded the papers neatly and placed them back in the envelope. She would not panic. Public erasure. The real pain came later that afternoon. Margaret went to the neighborhood grocery store, one she had shopped at for years. She moved slowly, carefully, aware of her body, her breath, her balance. Halfway down the aisle, she heard it. "Oh, that's her." She didn't turn. "She's the one Richard left." Margaret's fingers tightened around the cart. Another voice followed, quieter but sharper. "Isn't she too old to be pregnant?" That one cut deeper. She finished her shopping without looking up. At the checkout counter, the cashier avoided her eyes, sympathy mixed with discomfort. Margaret walked to her car, the weight of judgment pressing down on her shoulders. This was what Richard had done. Not just betrayal, but erasure. He hadn't simply replaced her. He had rewritten the story. Olivia's performance. That evening, Olivia hosted her first dinner in the house. Not officially. Not announced. But deliberately. Margaret knew. The signs, fresh flowers, candles, wine glasses she had never chosen. She stayed upstairs, resting, when she heard laughter downstairs, Richard's laugh, louder than she remembered. Voices followed. Friends. Colleagues. People Margaret had cooked for. Hosted. Smiled at for years. No one came to check on her. No one asked how she was. She stood at the top of the stairs, unseen, listening. "And Olivia just understands me," Richard said proudly. "She brings energy back into my life." Margaret closed her eyes. Olivia laughed softly. "Richard deserves happiness. Don't we all?" Someone replied, "You're glowing, Olivia. This house feels different already." Different. Margaret placed a hand against the wall to steady herself. Yes, it was different. Because kindness had been replaced with cruelty, and no one noticed. The first legal blow. The next morning, Margaret met with a lawyer of her own. She chose a small office downtown, nothing flashy. A woman in her early 40s named Claire Monroe. Claire listened quietly as Margaret explained everything. The pregnancy. The mistress. The eviction request. When Margaret finished, Claire leaned back in her chair. "He's trying to scare you," she said calmly. "And frankly, he assumes you'll fold." Margaret met her gaze. "I won't." Claire studied her for a moment. "You'd be surprised how many women say that, and still do." Margaret placed a hand over her belly. "I'm not most women." Claire nodded slowly. "Good. Because legally, you have more rights than he's suggesting. Especially given your condition." Margaret hesitated. "And financially?" Claire sighed. "That depends on what he's disclosed." Margaret didn't yet know how ironic those words were. Isolation. That night, Margaret packed more boxes. Not because she planned to leave, but because she needed control. Each item she packed was a memory reclaimed, not abandoned. A framed photo from her early marriage. A handwritten recipe from her mother. A baby blanket she had never thought. She worked slowly, methodically. Downstairs, Olivia laughed on the phone. "Yes, I know," Olivia said brightly. "It's awkward, but it won't be for long. Richard says everything will be settled soon." Margaret paused. Soon. The word echoed. She realized then Olivia didn't see her as a person. She saw her as a delay. Richard's first doubt. Later that evening, Richard found Margaret in the guest room, folding clothes. "You're packing already?" he asked. Margaret didn't look up. "I'm organizing." "For what?" "For whatever comes next." Something in her tone made him uneasy. "You don't have to make this harder than it is," he said. Margaret finally met his eyes. "You made it hard the moment you stopped seeing me as human." Richard scoffed. "You're being dramatic." Margaret smiled faintly. "You've always said that whenever I tell the truth." Richard shifted. "I just want this handled cleanly." "So do I," she replied. For the first time, Richard felt something unfamiliar. Not guilt. Uncertainty. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. She wasn't panicking. And that unsettled him. A quiet call. That same night, after everyone was asleep, Margaret's phone rang. Unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Collins?" a calm male voice asked. "Yes. My name is Daniel Reeves. I'm calling on behalf of a private estate matter. We've been trying to reach you for weeks." Margaret's heart slowed. "This concerns Jonathan Hale." The name meant nothing to her. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding," she said carefully. There was a pause. "No, Mrs. Collins," Daniel replied. "I believe there has been a lifetime of silence." Margaret sat down. "We will need to meet," he continued. "As soon as possible." Her hand trembled slightly. "What is this about?" Daniel's voice was steady. "Your inheritance." The line went dead. Closing scene. Margaret sat in the darkness, phone still in her hand. Her world, already shattered, had just shifted again. She didn't yet understand. How? She didn't yet know how much. But for the first time since Richard walked away, Margaret felt something rise inside her chest. Not fear. Not anger. Possibility. Upstairs, Olivia slept peacefully in borrowed comfort. Richard dreamed of a future he believed he controlled. Neither of them knew. The woman they were trying to erase had just been found. And soon, everything would change. The name that changed everything. Margaret didn't sleep that night. The house was silent, but her mind wasn't. The words echoed again and again. Your inheritance. She sat on the edge of the bed, one hand resting on her belly, the other clutching her phone as if it might ring again and explain everything it had just shattered. Jonathan Hale. The name meant nothing to her. And yet something about the way the man on the phone had said it felt heavy. Final. Like a door that had been closed for decades was suddenly unlocked. She stared at the dark window. "Who are you?" she whispered. "And why now?" The morning after. By morning, life continued, cruelly normal. Downstairs, Olivia moved through the kitchen like she owned it. Fresh coffee brewed. Music played softly. She hummed. Margaret came down slowly, careful with each step. Olivia glanced up, surprised, but not apologetic. "Good morning," she said, overly sweet. Richard already left for work. Margaret nodded. "I know." There was a pause. Olivia's eyes flicked, briefly, to Margaret's belly. "I hope you slept well," Olivia added. Margaret met her gaze calmly. "I slept awake." Olivia didn't understand what that meant, but she felt something shift. An unease she couldn't name. Margaret poured herself a glass of water. "I'll be out most of the day," Margaret said. Olivia smiled. "How's hunting?" Margaret turned slowly. No. There was no explanation. No argument. Just certainty. And for the first time, Olivia felt, irrationally, small. The address. The meeting was scheduled for noon. Downtown Chicago. Margaret arrived early, standing across the street from a glass building that reflected the sky like a mirror. Reeves and Caldwell, Private Estates Division. She hesitated before entering. Her reflection in the glass startled her. She looked tired. Older. But there was something else there too. Presence. She walked in. The lobby was quiet, expensive without being loud. A receptionist greeted her by name. "They're expecting you, Mrs. Collins." Margaret followed her to a private elevator. As the doors closed, her heart pounded not with fear, but with the instinct that something irreversible was about to happen. The file. Daniel Reeves stood when she entered the office. Mid-40s. Calm. Precise. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said. Margaret sat carefully. "I'd like to understand why I'm here," she replied. Daniel nodded. "Of course." He slid a thick file across the desk. "This," he said, "is the estate of Jonathan Hale." Margaret stared at the name. "Who is he?" she asked. Daniel folded his hands. "A man the world knew as a reclusive industrialist. A private investor. A ghost." Margaret frowned. "Then why me?" Daniel opened the file. "Because," he said gently, "Jonathan Hale was your father." The room tilted. Margaret's breath caught. "That's not possible," she said. "My father died when I was a child. A factory accident." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's what you were told." He slid forward an old photograph. A man in his 40s. Sharp eyes. Familiar eyes. Margaret's throat tightened. "This is a mistake," she whispered. Daniel shook his head. "We've verified it. Birth records. DNA confirmation. Legal documents signed decades ago." He paused. "Jonathan Hale died 6 weeks ago." Margaret's mind raced. 6 weeks. That was when everything started to fall apart. The truth they buried. "He didn't abandon you," Daniel continued. "He was forced to disappear." Margaret laughed softly, hollow. "People don't just disappear." Daniel leaned forward. "They do, when their enemies want them dead." Margaret stared at him. Jonathan Hale had built his empire quietly. Strategically. Offshore holdings. Shell corporations. Private trusts. He had made enemies. And when he discovered Margaret's mother was pregnant, he chose silence over exposure. He arranged another man to raise her. He watched from a distance. He protected her by staying away. "And now?" Margaret asked. Daniel exhaled. "Now he's gone. And you are his only living heir." Margaret felt her baby move. Life within life. "How much?" she asked quietly. Daniel hesitated. Then answered. "North of $10 trillion, once everything is consolidated." The word trillion didn't register. It sounded unreal. Like fiction. Margaret shook her head. "I don't want it," she said immediately. Daniel didn't look surprised. He expected that. Margaret looked up sharply. "You spoke to him?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Before he died." He slid another envelope across the desk. "He left you a letter." Margaret's hands trembled as she took it. The letter. She didn't open it right away. She couldn't. "Why now?" she asked. "Why reveal this when my life is already falling apart?" Daniel met her eyes. "Because," he said quietly, "he knew you'd need protection." Margaret swallowed. "From what?" Daniel stood and walked to the window. "From a world that believes you are disposable." Margaret thought of Richard. Of Olivia. Of eviction notices and whispered judgments. Daniel turned back. "He didn't give you wealth to feel powerful," he said. "He gave it to you so no one could ever silence you again." Margaret closed her eyes. Tears slipped down, not loud. Not dramatic. Just real. "The choice. You don't have to decide today," Daniel said. "You can walk away." Margaret looked at her hands. Hands that had cooked, cleaned, endured. Hands that now held something dangerous. "I'm not walking away," she said finally. Daniel nodded. "Good. Not for revenge," she added. "Not yet." Daniel smiled faintly. "That's usually how it starts." Margaret stood slowly. "For now," she said, "I want to understand everything." Daniel inclined his head. "Then welcome to a world that's been waiting for your entire life." As Margaret left the building, the city felt different. Sharper. Louder. Alive. She placed a hand on her belly. "We're not invisible anymore," she whispered. Across town, Richard signed documents, confident and careless. Olivia lounged in a house she thought she had won. Neither of them knew. The woman they underestimated had just stepped into a legacy powerful enough to rewrite every ending. a power she never asked for. Margaret sat in her car for nearly 20 minutes after leaving the building. She didn't turn the engine on. She didn't cry. She simply breathed slow, deliberate breaths, one hand resting on her belly as if grounding herself in something real. $10 trillion. The number still felt absurd. She had lived a life counting groceries, comparing prices, waiting for sales. She had learned how to stretch silence, how to survive neglect. And now the world had quietly placed a crown at her feet. One she had never asked for. The letter she couldn't ignore. She finally opened the envelope Daniel had given her. Jonathan Hale's handwriting was sharp but controlled, like a man who had learned to measure every word. Margaret, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and I have failed you once already. I watched your life from afar. Every milestone. Every sacrifice. Every time you chose dignity over ease. I stayed away not because I didn't love you, but because loving you openly would have destroyed you. Now I give you the only thing I can, protection. Use it wisely. Or don't use it at all. But never let the world tell you who you are again. Your father. Margaret folded the letter carefully. Her chest felt tight, not with anger, but with grief delayed by decades. I didn't need protection, she whispered. The baby moved gently. Yes, she corrected softly. I did. Returning to the lion's den. When Margaret arrived home, the house felt louder. Olivia was on the couch, scrolling through her phone, legs crossed casually. Richard wasn't home yet. Oh, Olivia said, looking up. You're back early. Margaret nodded. Something about her presence had changed. Olivia felt it instantly. You okay? Olivia asked, not out of concern, but curiosity. Margaret smiled faintly. I am now. That unsettled Olivia. Margaret walked past her, slow and deliberate, her pregnant belly leading the way, unapologetic, undeniable. For the first time, Olivia noticed how present she was. Not weak. Not fading. Present. Richard's confidence. Richard came home late that night, irritated. The office had been chaotic. A deal hadn't gone his way. Investors were asking questions he didn't like. He loosened his tie and stopped short when he saw Margaret sitting at the dining table. Waiting. Didn't expect you to still be here, he said. Margaret gestured to the chair across from her. Sit. The command was subtle, but unmistakable. Richard frowned but sat. What's this about? Margaret studied him. 23 years of marriage had taught her every version of this man. The charming one. The ambitious one. The dismissive one. Tonight, he was defensive. I met with a lawyer today, Margaret said calmly. Richard stiffened. I told you we're handling this professionally. So am I, she replied. She slid a single document across the table. Not the inheritance papers. Something else. Richard skimmed it and frowned. This is incorrect, he said. Margaret leaned back. Is it? Richard felt irritation spike. You don't have the assets to challenge me. Margaret didn't argue. She simply watched him. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Richard felt a flicker of doubt. Olivia's unease. Later that night, Olivia stood in the doorway of the bedroom she now shared with Richard. She's acting strange, Olivia said. Richard shrugged. She's scared. Olivia shook her head. No. Scared women cry. She paused. She's not crying. Richard didn't answer. He didn't like that observation. The call that changed the game. The next morning, Richard received a call from his bank. Routine. At least, that's what he thought. Mr. Collins, the banker said carefully, we need to discuss a temporary freeze. Richard straightened. Freeze on what? Several accounts connected to shared marital assets. Richard laughed sharply. That's impossible. I'm afraid it isn't, the banker replied. A third party has placed a legal hold pending verification. Richard's pulse quickened. A third party. He snapped. Who? The banker hesitated. I'm not authorized to disclose that. Richard hung up. His confidence cracked. Margaret's first boundary. Margaret spent the afternoon in the guest room, organizing documents. Claire Monroe, the lawyer, sat across from her. You're playing this carefully, Claire said. Good. Margaret nodded. I don't want chaos. Claire raised an eyebrow. Most people in your position would. Margaret placed both hands on her belly. I've lived in chaos quietly for years, she said. I want order. Claire studied her with new respect. There are entities moving behind the scenes, Claire added. Powerful ones. Margaret met her gaze. I know. A shift in the house. That evening, Margaret locked the guest room door. Olivia noticed. Did she just lock us out? Olivia asked incredulously. Richard didn't answer. He was staring at his phone, emails flooding in, meetings postponed, accounts delayed. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar. Vulnerability. The quiet warning. Margaret stood alone in the guest room, looking at herself in the mirror. A 50-year-old pregnant woman. Gray in her hair. Lines on her face. And yet, she had never felt more awake. She placed both hands on her belly. They underestimated us, she whispered. Outside the door, Richard argued on the phone. Olivia paced. Inside, Margaret breathed. Power didn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it arrived like this. Quiet. Measured. Unstoppable. Across the city, men in boardrooms reviewed files labeled Hale Holdings. Names resurfaced. Accounts aligned. A sleeping empire stirred. And at the center of it all, a woman the world had dismissed. A mother the world had ignored. A legacy that had finally found its rightful heir. The woman they couldn't control. Margaret stood outside the glass building as the cameras turned toward her. She hadn't planned the moment for spectacle. She hadn't rehearsed a speech. She hadn't worn armor. She had simply shown up. At 50 years old. Pregnant. Unbowed. The city noise faded as reporters recognized her. Margaret Collins. Mrs. Collins, is it true you're involved in the Hale estate? Are you here to comment on the divorce proceedings? Richard froze beside her. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had imagined Margaret leaving quietly, signing papers, disappearing, not standing here, centered, grounded, impossible to ignore. Margaret rested both hands over her belly. Then she spoke. The first sentence that ended everything. I will make one statement, she said calmly. No questions. The crowd hushed. My marriage is a private matter, Margaret continued. But my integrity is not. She looked directly at the cameras. For decades, I lived quietly. I raised a home. I sacrificed. I endured. She paused. And I was underestimated. Richard swallowed. Olivia's face drained of color. Margaret lifted her chin. I will not discuss money. I will not discuss numbers. But I will say this. Her voice sharpened, just slightly. Attempts to intimidate, erase, or displace me have failed. Cameras flashed wildly. I am not confused. I am not afraid. And I am not leaving anything that is rightfully mine. She placed one hand more firmly on her belly. Especially my future. And with that, she turned and walked away. No shouting. No tears. No revenge speech. Just presence. The fallout begins. Within an hour, Richard's phone was exploding. Board members. Legal advisors. Banks. What is Hale Holdings? Why is your wife connected to it? Why weren't we informed? Richard locked himself in his office. This was supposed to be his story. His career. His control. Now every search result carried Margaret's name. Not as a victim. As a question mark. And in corporate America, question marks are dangerous. Olivia breaks. That evening, Olivia packed her bags. Not quietly. Not gracefully. This is not what you promised me, she hissed. Richard didn't answer. He sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. You said she was nothing, Olivia continued. A leftover. A burden. Richard finally looked up. She was, he snapped. The word echoed. Was. Olivia stared at him. For the first time, she understood. She hadn't replaced Margaret. She had merely rented the illusion. You don't even know who she is, do you? Olivia said slowly. Richard didn't answer. Olivia laughed, bitter, hollow. She won, Olivia said. And she didn't even touch us. She walked out. The door closed softly behind her. Richard was alone. Margaret's choice. Margaret sat with Daniel Reeves the next morning. The final documents lay on the table. You can take full control today, Daniel said. Or you can remain silent indefinitely. Margaret looked at the papers. $10 trillion. Empires. Names. Power. She placed a hand on her belly. What happens if I do nothing? She asked. Daniel considered. Then the world keeps guessing. And guessing keeps people cautious. Margaret nodded. I don't want to destroy him, she said. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Margaret met his gaze. I want him to live knowing he destroyed himself. Daniel smiled slowly. A very hale decision. Margaret signed only one document. Not ownership. Protection, the final legal blow. 2 weeks later, Richard received the notice. Not divorce papers. Not a lawsuit. A restructuring notice. His company, his pride, had lost a key partnership. No explanation. No appeal. Just a signature at the bottom. M. Hale. Richard stared at it for a long time. Then his hands began to shake. The quiet victory. Margaret moved out on her own terms. Not into hiding. Into peace. A private residence. Secure. Calm. No interviews. No statements. She spent mornings walking slowly, hand on her belly. Evenings reading. Healing. The world speculated. Was she rich? Was she powerful? Was she dangerous? Margaret didn't answer. She didn't need to. The final scene. Months later, Margaret stood in a sunlit room. Her child slept peacefully nearby. Daniel's final message waited on her phone. Everything is in place. Margaret smiled faintly. She looked at her reflection. Not young. Not perfect. But whole. They thought silence meant weakness, she whispered. She turned toward the window. But silence, she said softly, was my preparation. She was never the woman they left behind. She was the legacy they never saw coming.